Daniel Whitmore sat alone in his wheelchair at 11 at night, the divorce papers still resting on the kitchen table where his wife had left them hours earlier. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint creak of the ceiling fan above him. He didn't move to pick the papers up. He didn't need to. He already knew every word printed on them by heart, because he had read them 3 times before she'd even walked out the door. What played louder in his mind wasn't the legal language. It was her voice, from months earlier, sharp and tired, echoing through the empty kitchen, as if she were still standing there. "I didn't sign up to be a nurse," she had told him, arms crossed, refusing to look him in the eye. Daniel had said nothing back that night. He simply nodded, the way he always did when there was nothing left worth arguing over. She thought she knew exactly who she was leaving behind. A man in a wheelchair. A man who couldn't work, couldn't drive, couldn't even carry his own groceries up the porch steps without help. A man, in her words, who had become a burden she never agreed to carry. She thought he had nothing left to lose, and in her mind, that made the decision easy. She signed the papers with the same certainty she used to sign grocery lists, confident there would be no consequence waiting on the other side. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Daniel Whitmore owned the one thing she would need most in the years ahead. Not money sitting in some account, not a piece of property. Something far closer to her future than she could possibly imagine, something she was about to walk straight into without ever seeing it coming. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how Vanessa Whitmore ended up walking away from a man who held more power over her future than she ever realized, you have to go back to the beginning, long before the accident, long before the papers, long before the words that ended their marriage. Because this isn't simply a story about a divorce. It's a story about 2 people who built a life together, only for one of them to stop seeing the man standing right in front of her. Somewhere between the exhaustion of caregiving and the resentment that quietly took root, Vanessa stopped asking questions that mattered. She never asked what Daniel did during those long afternoons alone in his study. She never asked why certain phone calls made him lower his voice. She never asked why a man who could barely lift a coffee cup still insisted on reading through thick folders of paperwork late into the night. What was Daniel really building behind closed doors, while his wife assumed he had nothing left to offer? Why did he choose to stay silent instead of correcting her, even as she told friends and family that she was carrying the weight of their marriage alone? And what exactly was the one thing he owned? The thing so significant that its discovery would eventually change everything Vanessa believed about the life she had chosen to leave behind. These are the questions that sat quietly underneath every conversation, every argument, every moment Vanessa mistook her husband's silence for defeat. The answers were already in motion long before she ever suspected them. Before the wheelchair, before the papers, before resentment ever found its way into their marriage, Daniel and Vanessa Whitmore were the kind of couple people pointed to as proof that good marriages still existed. They met in their late 20s, introduced by mutual friends at a backyard barbecue in a quiet Ohio suburb, and within a year they were married in a small ceremony, surrounded by family who genuinely believed the 2 of them were built for each other. Daniel worked as a construction foreman, proud of the calluses on his hands and the buildings he could point to across the city and say, "I helped build that." Vanessa worked as a registered nurse at a local hospital, known among her co-workers for her patience and her steady hands during even the most stressful shifts. Together they were practical, hard-working, and devoted, the kind of couple who spent Friday nights cooking dinner at home rather than chasing anything flashy. Daniel had always been a private man, not secretive, simply careful. He believed in keeping some things close to his chest until they were ready to be shared, a trait that came from watching his own father lose everything after boasting too early about a business deal that fell apart. Vanessa knew this about him and, in the early years, respected it. She used to joke that her husband could keep a surprise birthday party secret for months without cracking under pressure. What she didn't fully understand was how deep that instinct ran, or how far Daniel was willing to take it when it came to protecting the people he loved. Their early marriage wasn't without its ordinary struggles: tight finances in the beginning, disagreements over small things like whose turn it was to handle the bills, the usual friction of 2 strong personalities learning how to build a life together. But underneath it all was a foundation neither of them questioned. Daniel used to tell friends that Vanessa was the calmest person he'd ever met under pressure, someone who could walk into chaos and somehow make it feel manageable. Vanessa, in turn, admired Daniel's quiet determination, the way he never seemed rattled by setbacks, always working steadily towards something bigger than what was directly in front of him, even if he rarely explained exactly what that something was. It was during their 6th year of marriage that Daniel began spending more time on what he vaguely referred to as an opportunity, meeting occasionally with an old army friend named Marcus Doyle, a sharp, business-minded man Daniel had served alongside years earlier. Vanessa noticed the increased phone calls and the folder Daniel kept locked in his desk drawer, but she never pushed for details. She trusted him. At the time, there was no reason not to. Life felt steady, predictable in the best way, the kind of predictable that lulls people into believing nothing will ever truly test the strength of what they've built. Neither of them could have imagined how quickly that would change, or how much would be riding on the decisions Daniel had quietly been making in the background. The accident happened on a Tuesday morning in early spring, the kind of ordinary day that gives no warning before it changes everything. Daniel was supervising a crew on the 3rd floor of a commercial building under construction, the same kind of job he had done 1,000 times before, without incident. A section of scaffolding, improperly secured by a subcontractor cutting corners to save time, gave way beneath him without warning. Daniel fell nearly 20 feet, landing hard on a concrete slab below. By the time paramedics arrived, he was conscious, but unable to feel his legs, a detail the responding EMT would later describe as one of the most difficult moments of his career, watching a grown man ask calmly, almost too calmly, whether he was going to walk again. The diagnosis came days later at the hospital, where, coincidentally, Vanessa had worked for years, though not in the unit treating her husband. Spinal cord injury, incomplete but severe, with doctors unable to promise how much mobility, if any, Daniel would eventually recover. Vanessa sat beside his hospital bed those first few nights, holding his hand, telling him they would get through it together, the way they had gotten through everything else. Family members praised her devotion. Friends called her strong. For a while, it seemed like their marriage might actually be tested and come out stronger on the other side, the kind of story people tell at anniversaries as proof that love survives hardship. But recovery is rarely as clean as the speeches people give in hospital rooms. The months that followed were long and physically demanding, filled with medical appointments, physical therapy sessions, and the slow, humbling process of Daniel relearning how to manage basic tasks he once never thought twice about. Vanessa, still working full shifts at the hospital, found herself coming home to a second job no one had trained her for, one with no clock-out time and no co-workers to share the load. She began skipping her own doctor's appointments to make time for his. She started declining invitations from friends because she was simply too exhausted to explain, again, why she couldn't make it. Somewhere in those exhausting months, gratitude quietly turned into resentment, and resentment, left unspoken for too long, began to calcify into something closer to contempt. Daniel noticed the shift before Vanessa ever said a word about it. He noticed it in the way she sighed when helping him transfer from his wheelchair to the couch, the way her responses grew shorter, the way she started referring to his appointments as another thing on my plate, rather than something they were facing together. He never confronted her about it directly. Instead, he did what he had always done when circumstances threatened to overwhelm him. He turned inward, quietly, deliberately, and began putting more energy into the very thing he had been building with Marcus Doyle long before the accident ever happened. A decision that would soon matter far more than either of them could have predicted. By the 2nd year after the accident, the cracks in Daniel and Vanessa's marriage had grown too wide to ignore, even for two people who had built their entire relationship on quietly pushing through hardship. Vanessa had started confiding in her older sister, Renee, a woman who had never fully approved of Daniel to begin with, and who now saw every complaint as confirmation she had been right all along. Renee's advice was consistent and increasingly blunt. Vanessa deserved a life, she said, not a permanent assignment as an unpaid caregiver. She reminded Vanessa again and again that she was still young, still capable of more, still allowed to want something different than hospital transfers and modified showers, and a husband who could no longer walk her down a beach or dance with her at a wedding. What Renee didn't know, and what Vanessa never bothered to ask, was what Daniel had actually been doing during the hours she assumed he spent idle at home. While Vanessa grew more distant, Daniel had grown more focused. The settlement from his workplace injury, modest as it was, became seed money he funneled quietly into the venture he and Marcus Doyle had been developing for years. A company aimed at improving in-home rehabilitation and care services, born directly out of Daniel's own frustration with the gaps he witnessed in the system meant to help people like him. He worked from his study for hours at a time, reviewing contracts, sitting in on calls with investors, learning an entirely new industry from a wheelchair Vanessa assumed had made him powerless. Vanessa never asked what those calls were about. She assumed, without ever confirming it, that Daniel was simply passing time, perhaps managing old paperwork from his previous job, perhaps distracting himself from the reality of his condition. It never occurred to her that the folder locked in his desk drawer contained shares in a growing company, or that the modest disability checks she believed were their only real source of income were being carefully reinvested into something with far greater reach than either of them had imagined at the start. Daniel let her believe what she wanted to believe. It was easier than trying to explain something she had already stopped being curious about. By the time Vanessa first mentioned the word divorce out loud, quietly, almost testing how it would sound, Daniel had already become the majority stakeholder in a company that was expanding faster than even Marcus had predicted. She had no idea. She was too busy counting everything she believed she was losing to notice what her husband had quietly gained, and how directly it was about to intersect with her own future, in ways she could not yet begin to understand. The divorce moved faster than Daniel expected, faster than most people believed a marriage of 11 years should end. Vanessa filed on a Thursday afternoon, citing irreconcilable differences, and within weeks, the house they had shared was listed, their finances divided, their life together reduced to a stack of paperwork handled by lawyers who had never met either of them before that year. Vanessa moved into a small apartment across town, telling friends and family she finally felt like she could breathe again, free from what she described as years of feeling trapped by circumstances she never asked for. Daniel said little in response to any of it. He signed what needed to be signed, agreed to what needed to be agreed, and let Vanessa walk away, believing she had lost nothing of real value in the process. 2 years passed. Vanessa's life, though lighter in some ways, grew harder in others she hadn't anticipated. Her mother, Carol, began showing signs of advanced arthritis and early cognitive decline, requiring more consistent in-home support than Vanessa could manage alone while working full hospital shifts. A co-worker recommended a home care agency that had recently expanded into the area, praised for its quality of service and surprisingly affordable rates for families without extensive insurance coverage. The agency was called Meridian Home Care, part of a larger healthcare holding company that had quietly become one of the fastest-growing names in the industry over the past several years. Vanessa scheduled an intake appointment, filled out the necessary paperwork, and sat across from a case coordinator explaining her mother's needs in detail, relieved to finally find a service she could actually afford. It wasn't until she was reviewing the ownership documentation attached to a reduced-rate care agreement, standard paperwork required for the discounted plan she qualified for, that a name near the bottom of the page stopped her cold. Listed as majority shareholder of Ashcombe Holdings, the parent company overseeing Meridian Home Care, was a name she hadn't expected to see printed on any document tied to her mother's future. Daniel Whitmore, the man she had once called a burden, was now, in some indirect and deeply uncomfortable way, the reason her mother would receive the care she desperately needed. Vanessa sat frozen in the coordinator's office for what felt like several minutes, staring at Daniel's name, printed in plain black text, on a document that had nothing to do with him as far as she knew. She asked the coordinator to repeat the ownership structure twice, hoping she had misread it, hoping it was simply a coincidence involving a different Daniel Whitmore somewhere in the state. The coordinator, unaware of any personal history, calmly explained that Ashcombe Holdings had grown rapidly over the past 3 years under the direction of its founding investors, one of whom, according to public filings, had a personal connection to the very mission the company was built around. Vanessa left the office that afternoon with her mother's paperwork in hand, and a question she could no longer ignore, sitting heavy in her chest. She called Daniel that same evening, her voice tighter than she intended, asking flatly whether he had known Meridian Home Care would be the agency handling her mother's case. Daniel didn't lie. He never had, even when silence served him better. He explained, calmly and without any trace of bitterness, that Ashcombe Holdings had grown out of frustration born directly from his own experience after the accident. Frustration with an industry that too often failed the very people who needed it most. He told her he had never once directed a client toward the company, had no involvement in day-to-day case assignments, and had genuinely not known Carol's case would land under his own company's umbrella until Vanessa said her mother's name out loud. Vanessa didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to accuse him of some elaborate, calculated setup, a quiet trap designed to humiliate her years after their divorce. But the more Daniel spoke, without defensiveness, without any attempt to make her feel smaller than she already did, the more she understood there had been no plan involving her at all. Daniel hadn't built Ashcombe Holdings to prove a point. He built it because he refused to let the worst year of his life be the end of his story, because he had spent months feeling powerless, and decided somewhere in that darkness that he would rather build something meaningful than remain the man Vanessa once described as nothing more than a burden. She asked him quietly why he never told her any of it while they were still married. Daniel's answer was simple. He said he tried, in small ways, but by then she had already stopped asking questions about his life, already decided in her mind who he was and what he had left to offer. He wasn't angry when he said it. He simply stated it as fact, the same steady tone he had used through every hospital appointment, every setback, every quiet evening she had grown too tired to notice. In the weeks following that conversation, Vanessa found herself replaying it constantly, turning Daniel's words over in her mind during quiet moments at work, during the drive to her mother's apartment, during the late hours when sleep refused to come easily. She had spent years telling herself a version of their story where she was the one who endured, the one who sacrificed, the one who finally found the courage to walk away from a life that had become too heavy to carry. That version had never once made room for the possibility that Daniel had been carrying something too, quietly, without asking for credit or sympathy, while she assumed he had nothing left to give. Carol's care through Meridian Home Care continued without incident, the coordinators professional and attentive, the cost manageable in a way Vanessa hadn't expected. She never asked Daniel to intervene, and true to his word, he never did. Months later, she learned from a mutual acquaintance that Ashcombe Holdings had quietly established a foundation offering reduced-cost care to families who couldn't otherwise afford consistent in-home support. A foundation Daniel had funded personally, largely anonymous, rarely mentioned in any public materials tied to the company. Vanessa realized, reading through an old newsletter she stumbled across online, that her mother's discounted plan had likely been part of that very foundation, not a coincidence of paperwork, but the quiet result of a decision Daniel had made long before her mother ever needed care at all. Daniel, for his part, had continued moving forward with the same steady determination that had once defined their marriage. Years of physical therapy and an experimental treatment program had restored partial mobility, enough that he now walked short distances with the help of a cane, something doctors had once told him might never be possible. He rarely spoke publicly about his personal life, preferring instead to let Ashcombe Holdings' work speak for itself. When reporters occasionally asked about his motivation for entering the home care industry, he offered the same brief explanation every time, that he had once been told he was a burden, and he decided the best response wasn't anger, but proof. Vanessa never remarried. She often thought back to the man she had once dismissed as having nothing left to offer, and wondered how differently things might have unfolded had she asked more questions, instead of assuming she already knew every answer. There was no dramatic reconciliation between them, no tearful reunion audiences might expect from a story like this. Just two people who had once built a life together, forever changed by how easily worth can be misjudged when someone stops truly looking. Would you have seen his worth, or walked away like she did? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.